Okay, first of all, Mahmood Bhai, I welcome back. I welcome you back on the show. Hope you're well. Let's walk through the main news of Gaza, Palestine. Then we'll take it from there. How are you? What's up?
Thank you for having me. Alhamdulillah, brother. All well. The situation in Gaza is continuing with the fragile ceasefire. Israel is still breaching regularly the ceasefire agreement. Yesterday, they killed two people in Khan Yunis, an area called Bani Sela. And there were some interesting revelations coming from the Palestinian resistance. So let's begin with the ceasefire side. Well, first, we have continued breaches. The Euromed monitor, Human Rights Monitor published a report saying that Israel is continuing the genocide by making the life conditions impossible in Gaza. Israel is still not allowing the required levels of aid to go. So aid is going in. There are bits of heavy equipment going in, certain developments happening, but not to the required level. In the meantime, they are still having breaches. They're still destroying homes in the areas that are under their control in Gaza, where they are positioned. And there are still talks about this second phase with the International Stabilization Force that hasn't been confirmed so far because clearly there are certain developments happening there that both sides do not agree on. However, one of the most notable things that happened is, well, there were talks. Firstly, if you recall, there were two very intense breaches of the ceasefire from Israel. At the time, Israel claimed that Palestinian fighters in Rafah attacked it. The official statement that came from the armed wing of Hamas at the time, Al-Qassam brigades, said that they have no knowledge of these clashes and that they lost contact with the fighters that they had in the Rafah area. Now, the Palestinian resistance confirmed that it does still have fighters in Rafah. There were talks in the past several weeks coming from the mediators, talking about, well, some of them, talking about the need to resolve the matter of the Hamas or Al-Qassam brigades fighters in Rafah. And of course, from their side, they clarified that the clashes that happened between, or any clashes that would happen between the Palestinian resistance and Israel in these areas would be Israel's responsibility as an occupying force in those areas. If they wouldn't allow, for example, the Palestinian resistance to move armed and what have you, which is obvious. I mean, Israel would try and use any pretext, but let's be frank here. At the end of the day, they are the occupying force. They are the genocidal entity of terror. So at the time, it wasn't confirmed, but now they confirmed. And that means that they still have fighters who are armed. Now, the talks were before that Israel would allow them safe passage if they hand in their weapons. Yesterday, they said surrender is not in our lexicon. It's not going to happen. We either remain here armed and Israel does nothing, or we go back to the area that is under Palestinian resistance control up until, of course, the later phases continue, where Israel would have to withdraw, because in phase two, Israel must withdraw completely, according to what we heard from the ceasefire agreement. They're supposed to completely withdraw, and the International Stabilization Force is supposed to go in. Therefore, you have that case going on, and there are certain attempts to try and resolve it, and there's likelihood that it will be resolved because the Palestinian resistance participated after the ceasefire in areas that the IDF is still in, that the Israeli occupation terror army is still in. Therefore, this indicates that they wouldn't necessarily have a problem up until the end for them going back. But it could go the opposite way. It could go towards an escalation and Netanyahu using it as a pretext. However, if we read through the map carefully and we read the statements coming from Israel and from the mediators too, we understand that this is a path to completely end the war. And it's quite unlikely that Benjamin Netanyahu would go on an all-out campaign again in Gaza, as in full-blown genocide. He would want to continue the slow-mo genocide, but he wouldn't necessarily want to go on a full-scale genocide for various reasons. Number one, they don't have the pretext of the prisoners of war, although the resistance told them from day one they're willing to return them so long that they have a swap prisoners. But they used that because they had greater plans. Then they realized they can't achieve those greater plans of expelling and ethnically cleansing the population completely. That's not going to happen. Therefore, there's no pretext, really. There is no motive. There is no backing and full support, apart from certain circles within the extreme right wing of Israel. But it's still fragile, nevertheless. And Israel is still breaching, of course, but there's always a risk. Now, moving on to the talks about the second phase and the talks about the mediators' involvement. If we recall, Donald Trump before said that he's going to be in charge. Of course, it's questionable, but he said that they're going to be in charge. There is an American Central Command now in an area called Kiryat Gat in South occupied Palestine that is in charge of the operations that Israel is conducting in Gaza, for the most part. According to Israeli reports, they're even preventing Israel from conducting certain missions, and they're saying what should be done and what shouldn't be done. Now, however, there has been a recent revelation, and that revelation is that the United States is planning to build a $500 million base exactly next to Gaza. An American base just outside of Gaza, technically inside of Israeli territories. And that base is going to be monitoring the situation in Gaza moving forward. That could be the translation of the guarantee of Israel not restarting the war. Could be part of it. Again, not confirming that it will happen, but this could be an interpretation of that. Because the United States so far, they are preventing Israel from conducting certain operations. They forced Israel to go back and de-escalate after Israel escalated several times. They forced Israel to reopen the border for aid within 24 hours after Netanyahu threatened he's going to cut the aid completely. Because you need to understand, Netanyahu's argument now in the right-wing circles in Israel isn't really going well. He promised everything up until the collapse of Hamas and all of that talk. None of that happened. And now they clearly have Hamas controlling the areas that Israel withdrew from. Now, if the United States has the base already in South Israel, and they are dictating what Israel doesn't do to a very large extent, they are also heavily involved in the amount of aid that goes in Gaza. If the United States establishes a base, and by the way, that base is being heavily criticized, again, within circles that are generally aligned with the right wing in Israel, because to them it's as if we lost sovereignty. We lost sovereignty of our country, and we have international forces here. Because think about it for a second. Israel has international forces, Gaza doesn't. Think about that very carefully. Gaza doesn't have international forces so far. Israel does. And there is no time limit. That's another thing. There's no time limit for the existence of the international force in Israel. The United States, Britain, the UAE and Jordan, I believe, are participating too. But it's mainly the United States. You know the score. So if they go and build a base now next to Gaza, what would that mean? That would mean, and by the way, with very, very minimal participation, as in the man in charge of that region in the Israeli army will be irrelevant to that level. This is what they're saying in Israeli media. He will be irrelevant in the decision making. So what would that mean, though? What would that mean on the ground? Well, if we go back before Al-Aqsa flood began, there was a Gaza division. Gaza division had multiple bases around Gaza. And the Palestinian resistance demolished them within 40 minutes to 2 hours. This is one of the propagandas of the 7th of October is the fact that they never mentioned that. They tell you about the massacres that Israel did against its own people. They completely don't talk about the huge military failure and military failure of Israel, military accomplishment of the Palestinian resistance in taking that whole division down that was supposed to be the most advanced, sophisticated, well-equipped tech, everything. And they imprisoned many of them, of course, including top commanders. If that Gaza division, if the United States is going to establish a base, and we're not talking about a small base like with, no, half a bit, 500 million US dollars. That's a lot of money to establish one base. We're talking about something very substantial here. We're not talking about some sort of a temporary. No, we're talking about a very important base, and that would mean that the United States is planning to remain in occupied Palestine for a prolonged period. That's what it would mean. Where do we go from there? Well, we need to understand firstly how did we reach here? We reached this place because Netanyahu refused to have a proper back and forth with the United States in terms of de-escalation, to a level where there stopped being any trust between him and the American administration. Forget about the influence and forget about the money and forget about the Israeli lobby for a second. Netanyahu's government and the American administration, or at least many elements within the American administration, there's no trust. The United States started to view Israel as more of a liability, at least in form of the government. That did not affect their strategic relationship or how they view Israel in general, any of that, or it doesn't, of course, reduce from the evilness of the United States administration. No, fully complicit. But there are differences there, and that led the United States to lose trust and faith in the Netanyahu government to a level where they now want to establish, you can call it a permanent base. If they would want to do that, and Netanyahu wouldn't be able to oppose or do anything, what does that tell you? That tells you that the United States and the mediators and the parties involved are looking for a long-term solution. A long-term solution, as in, we're going to talk about a de-escalation at least, or a ceasefire, whatever it is, for at least 5 to 10 years. And in the meantime, they're talking about a Palestinian state, a Palestinian entity. They're talking about disarmament. Steve Witkoff is saying that Hamas agreed to disarm. He's not revealing, though, how. Hamas agreed to disarm for a Palestinian state, as in a full sovereign Palestinian state. Hamas didn't agree to disarm. As a matter of fact, fully opposed disarming without a sovereign Palestinian state with a national army. That's out of the question. Steve Witkoff is saying that to try and reassure the Israeli side. The Israeli side, well, they bit many bullets. They're going to probably have to bite another bullet in the form of disarmament and the formula. But if they do, if they are very interested in really disarming the Palestinian resistance, they're going to have to accept an army. They're going to have to accept a Palestinian state. Now, that formula can be easily accomplished in Gaza, but it would be way more difficult to accomplish in the West Bank, because Gaza already was a liberated location that then Israel besieged and waged several wars on to take down the democratic elected government. It had no Israeli squatters since 2005, since Israel unilaterally dismantled the settler colonial project and expelled 9,000 squatters. One of the reasons was, of course, the resistance there. But Israel also had a strategic view of dividing Gaza and the West Bank. However, in the West Bank, it's going to be far more difficult to establish something like that. But if you recall, the United States administration said multiple times, multiple figures said that Israel will not be annexing the West Bank. We won't accept them annexing the West Bank. despite the fact that some in the Israeli government were waiting for that approval from Trump because he previously moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. In the West Bank, you have 900,000 Israeli squatters. Is there going to be a certain formula? The Palestinian political sides reportedly agreed to have unity between the West Bank and Gaza, but there are still elements who are very tied with Israel and the West Bank Authority. Did they reach a stage where they realized everyone could be losing everything and it's time we put our hands with each other because of the level of sacrifices of the Palestinian people? That could be the case. So that's what's happening. There are more questions than answers. And once again, it's a case of continuing to monitor the situation up until the developments reveal themselves. But what we're seeing so far now is more American involvement in the scene, Israel taking a back step slowly, and the Palestinian side de facto in control of these areas. No confirmation about the ISF, but the negotiations are ongoing.
Yeah, Mahmood bhai, how is the world reacting to another base in occupied Palestine?
We haven't had a chance to hear the responses
Mm,
so far, because mind you, these are very, very fresh reports coming from
mm,
Israel.
mm, mm.
And the United States didn't confirm so far. Israel also didn't confirm so far. These are reports, though, coming from Israel about a United States base being set up in that location. I think that from an Israeli perspective, it's quite embarrassing for Netanyahu because the HQ in the southern part of occupied Palestine in Kiryat Gat, the central command, already embarrassed Netanyahu to a level where he had to go on a tour there and say that, we are working in coordination with our American counterparts to disarm Hamas and make sure the plan goes ahead. Really, everyone reading between the lines knows very well that the United States came because they're literally babying Israel now. They don't trust Netanyahu, they don't trust the Israeli army, they don't have faith in them, and that's why they came and took over. Well, what else can you call it? There is no other interpretation. And again, you need to contextualize everything. Yes, there is the influence. Yes, there is the lobby. There is the influence in American politics. But at the end of the day, for a country like the United States to send this force there indicates that they have no trust in Israel. And also, this is a central command that would be in charge of a situation without military participation in Gaza, by the way. We're just talking about the International Stabilization Force in Gaza, and that's going to be there for a temporary period. Chances are this American command is going to have a lot to do with the International Stabilization Force. But again, the mechanism and the responsibilities are still not clearly published. So this was still fresh, so not many responses came out in relation to this. But what we do understand is that there's more American involvement.
How are our Palestinian brothers and sisters taking this?
I think the Palestinian people in Gaza, first and foremost, need the relief. I think the people are happy that the full-blown genocidal attacks stopped. Yes, there are breaches that need to stop, but the minute by minute attacks that stop. I think that people are focusing on rebuilding their lives, trying to know what happens, and trying to pass this phase of uncertainty. And let's not forget that they're living in catastrophic conditions. Like the living conditions in Gaza now, these are not human conditions. I mean, these are not even animal conditions. What's happening in Gaza now is the majority of the population are living in tents that hardly protect them from anything. No sanitation, no proper food security, no medical and healthcare security. A lot of the aid is still prevented from going in, blocked from going in. They still need, well, several hundred thousand need to be treated urgently because of the damage of the past 2 years. Many of them would need to go and get medical aid outside of Gaza and then come back because Israel, of course, destroyed all of the healthcare facilities as part of their ongoing war crimes, targeting hospitals. And in relation to the International Stabilization Force, I think there's a firm understanding for in the people of Gaza primarily that the Palestinian resistance will not give up or surrender. That has been evident by now. Everyone understands that. There would be, of course, some people who deliberately or unknowingly serve the enemies of the Palestinian people by saying things against the Palestinian resistance. But they would either have motives or they would be totally ignorant. Like this situation in Rafah now, for example, with the Palestinian fighters. That's a clear indication that these people are basing their battle against the Zionist entity on morals, on principles, on faith. That's why they're not willing to submit. They're being offered, if they're being offered safe passage or whatever. And that's the journey, by the way. If we want to talk about Hamas in particular, by the way, well, they had hundreds of millions flowing in to Gaza, didn't they, before 2023? With the knowledge of Netanyahu, by the way, through Qatar, cash was going in. They thought that they were going to bribe them. They thought that they could be bought. As a matter of fact, the previous leader of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, he said that we will make the whole world stand on one foot if the Palestinian people's rights are not granted for them and given for them. He said that we will remove all of the legitimacy from Israel across the whole world. And they did after Al-Aqsa flood. So some people, of course, don't understand that. And some people, well, they serve the enemies of the Palestinian people, either by financial motives or anything else. So the Palestinian people, they know very well that and these of course are a minority, but the Palestinian people, they realize that the Palestinian resistance, they sacrificed the most at the end of the day. It was their families being targeted, them being targeted, and all of that. Even if you look at the leadership, their sons and their daughters, their extended family, and them, how many of them were killed or martyred? So that's clear, but a lot of it is for the days to reveal what's coming. There are certain red lines that will not be crossed. However, coming up with a formula that would work based on the needs of the Palestinian side and in a way that will not necessarily make Israel look as a loser is very difficult. Saying that, however, Israel made several concessions so far, and we wouldn't be surprised if they do more in the coming days and in the coming months and in the coming years too.